Shalom. Purim is coming. I want to welcome you to my home in the old city of Jerusalem, and I want to share with you two stories that illustrate what really is the essence of Purim. Purim is the holiday of the hiddenness of God. Megillat Esther, the scroll of Esther that we read on Purim, both at night and in the morning, is the only book of the Bible that does not mention God. There's also something about Song of Songs, but okay, well, controversial. The scroll of Esther does not mention God. Why? And why a book that doesn't even mention God should be in the Bible really is the bigger question. And the answer is that it really is all about the workings of the divine for the salvation of Purim, how we, the Jewish people, were saved from the decree of Haman, really by tremendous salvation from God, but it came very indirectly through coincidences and synchronicities. Esther was chosen at this terrible beauty contest, to become the queen of Persia. And she lived in the palace for 5 years. I mean, why she had to be, in this situation? I mean, there was a harem. It was a really terrible situation. But she was the queen. She became the queen after spending a very long time in the harem, getting ready for the beauty, to be at night with this potentate, Ahasuerus. But for 5 years, she was there in the palace. And what was she doing there? A Jewish woman, trapped into a marriage with this really hedonistic Oriental ruler, emperor. So the way the story unfolds, there are all kinds of miracles, and in the end, all kinds of not miracles, not revealed miracles, all kinds of coincidences. And this happened and that happened, and then it turns out that Esther being in that position ends up being the key to all kinds of synchronicities happen in this story. So what we see is that God's hand in the story of the redemption, the salvation of Purim, is very hidden. It's indirect. And that's the way our lives are. God is hidden. This is the reality. The Purim story took place after the destruction for 70 years after the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem. Right here, where I'm speaking to you from, right here in my home in Jerusalem, a few hundred meters away was where the first temple and the second temple stood. The first temple was a place where there were 10 miracles, and prophecy reigned in those days. God was very revealed during that time in Jewish history, the biblical time. There were schools of prophets. The sages say that there were as many prophets in ancient Israel as there were Jews who left Egypt, which means a minimum 600,000 and maybe up to 3 million. So God was very revealed during the time of the first temple. But when the first temple was destroyed, prophecy also came to an end, and God went into this place of hiddenness, where, like we read in Megillat Esther, we only see God's hands through coincidences and synchronicities and things that you have to see the bulge in the curtain. When something is hidden, it means it's there, but you can't clearly see it. Like someone hiding behind a curtain. You see the bulge in the curtain, but you can't see who it is that's hiding there. So that's God for the last 2,000 years. Now, the hiddenness of God is a big problem for us who live in a world where God is very hidden. I remember when I first started learning about Judaism in Jerusalem 36 years ago, my very brilliant teacher, Rebbetzin Zipporah Heller, she used to say to me, I had all these questions. How could so many bad things happen to good people? All the questions of suffering. And she made it clear to me, God is a hidden God. We don't see him clearly. But that doesn't mean he's not there. And it is a principle of Judaism, that God not only created the world, but he's intimately involved with us, intimately involved with every one of us. It's called hashgacha pratit, on a very personal level. So I want to share with you two stories. That both of them are about the hiddenness of God. One is a happier story, but the other one is a deeper story. So the first story, I heard this directly from a jeweler in San Diego. His name is Sean Levy. He himself told me this story. You're getting it secondhand from secondhand. I heard it firsthand from Sean Levy, to whom it happened. So Sean has a jewelry shop in San Diego. And one morning, a diamond merchant, we're calling him Roger, came in. This story, both stories I want to share with you are from my book, Heaven Prince. So, and I think, we'll tell you in the notes, we'll tell you how you can order this book from Art Scroll. It's an Art Scroll, Art Scroll published this book, Heaven Prince, because just like there are fingerprints who reveal who done it, there are heaven prints that reveal who did it. Anyway, here's the story. So Roger came in early in the morning, and he wanted to sell Sean some diamonds, and they haggled over the price, and they didn't agree. And Roger, who was a volatile man, got very angry, and he hurled insults at Sean and then left in a huff. So Sean's a traditional Jew. He always brought his tefillin to work with him. That they started early, but at some point he would put on his tefillin and say Shema and other prayers. And so he took his tefillin from their boxes and he started to put on his tefillin when he noticed something shiny on the floor. And he picked it up, and it was a large diamond. He estimated that it must have been worth about $50,000. And he figured, it didn't take much figuring, that it must have fallen from Roger's pocket. So he decided he was going to call Roger as soon as he finished his prayers. Because we each have what's called a choice box. Rebbetzin Heller calls it a choice box, where there's certain things that are in our choice box. They're really choices for us that we have to really grapple with. And there are other things that are not even choices. Of course, what they're doing, we're not, either they're too high for us or they're too beneath us. We wouldn't do it. So it was beneath Sean's choice box to keep that diamond. He was not a thief, and he wasn't going to do it. And he resolved that as soon as he finished his prayers, he would call Roger and tell him he dropped this diamond and he had it. So he put on his tefillin and started to recite his prayers. And at that point, what was really in his choice box? It wasn't in his choice box whether to steal the diamond. No, an honest man, he wasn't going to steal that diamond. What was in his choice box was he going to let Roger squirm for 15 minutes or so before he called him to tell him that he had the diamond? Roger had yelled at him. Roger had been nasty to him. And he had his prayers to say. So, okay, let him squirm for 15 minutes. He was nasty to me. That was his real choice. Do I let this man who was nasty to me squirm for 15 minutes, or do I tell him right away, I have the diamond with me? And he passed that test, and he decided to interrupt his prayers and call him right away to tell him that I have the diamond. So he called on the phone, and Roger answered, and he said, I can't talk now. I've lost a 5-carat diamond that didn't even belong to me. I'll be paying it off forever. And Sean said to him, you have nothing to worry about. I found the diamond in my store. It's waiting for you right here. It's safe and sound. Come and get it whenever you want. So then, having delivered his message, Sean returned his attention back to God and recited his prayers with his tefillin on. Barely 1 hour later, an unshaven man, this all happened before the jewelry shop opened, but an hour later, when the jewelry shop was open, an unshaven man wearing dilapidated clothes stopped in front of the store, and he peered into the window, and he beckoned to the salesgirl to come outside. Now, the man looked like a homeless vagrant, and he looked like he couldn't even afford cup of coffee, let alone Sean's cheapest piece of jewelry. But the sales girl, saw him beckoning, like, come out here. She flashed Sean a look, but she was a good sales girl. She dutifully went outside and she said to the man, may I help you? And he said, how much does that necklace cost? And he pointed to a necklace in the window. And she was like laughing inside, but she said very respectfully, she said, that necklace cost $20,000. And then he said, how much do those earrings cost? And she said, those earrings cost $10,000. And the man said, I'll take them both. He entered the shop and he reached into a torn leather pouch that he was carrying and he counted out $30,000 in cash. And Sean and the sales girl just looked on in shock. A few hours later, a bag lady came into the store. She was wearing frumpy, mismatched clothing, and she put down her bags and she started browsing. And she picked out a few pieces, and she brought them over to buy them, and they totaled $20,000. She bought them, and she trudged out. So from these two unlikely customers, Sean sold $50,000 worth of jewelry within a few hours of having returned a $50,000 diamond that he found. This is what we call the hidden hand of God. Sean did something noble, proper, honest. He returned a $50,000 diamond to someone who had been nasty to him. And he did it quickly and right away. And God rewarded him with $50,000 in sales within just a few hours from the most unlikely customers. That's what we call the hidden hand of God. Now, you could say, well, it was just a coincidence. And that's exactly what we learn in Megillat Esther, the theme of Purim. We could attribute everything to coincidences, or we can see the bulge behind the curtain and identify that this comes from God. Because in Judaism, the first two of the 10 commandments are, the first one is, I'm the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. It doesn't even sound like a commandment. What's the command? It's a statement. But our rabbis teach us that the commandment is to believe in God, to believe in a God, not the God who created the worlds, but the God who took us out of Egypt, the God who intervenes in history, in our lives for our benefit. That's the first commandment. And the second commandment is not to believe in any other forces. So we can translate the words mean don't believe in any other gods. And think, well, I'm not a pagan, I don't believe in other gods. But the truth is, there are many gods who compete in our day and age with God. There's when you believe in the stock market, when you believe in politics, when you believe in any force other than God, you are violating the second commandment, second of the 10 commandments, not to believe in any other forces. There is no other forces, only God. Human beings have free will, but what actually happens comes from God. But since the destruction of the first temple, around the time of the Purim story, God went into hiddenness. So identifying that this comes from God is the basic act of faith in God, and that God intervenes in the world for our benefit. Now, this can become problematic theologically because we see so many good people suffer. So that's what this second story is about, that even in a situation of suffering, God is still present and still loves us. So here's the story. Again, it's a true story. I heard this story from Jonathan Rosenblum, who heard it from the person that it happened to. It happened to a cardiologist in Toronto, whose name is Dr. Earl Nussbaum. So it was a rainy afternoon in Toronto, And Dr. Nussbaum realized that his secretary had mistakenly scheduled an appointment with him for an elderly woman who had previously been seen by another cardiologist in his group practice. This woman was not even his patient. Moreover, Dr. Nussbaum was supposed to pick up his daughter after school at that exact time, and it was a rainy day, and the daughter was going to be waiting at a bus stop that did not have any protection. So he was not real keen to take this patient, but he figured that it was a mistake. She wasn't his patient, but no other doctor in the practice would take her, he figured, and so he just decided to do it. He met with her, and after speaking to the patient and examining her, he ordered a series of tests, and he scheduled a follow-up appointment to go over the results. When the elderly woman and her husband came for the next visit, Dr. Nussbaum was pleased to inform them that all her test results were fine. Her heart was in good shape, and her symptoms were not a cause of concern. But much to Dr. Nussbaum's surprise, she showed no relief. In fact, she showed no emotion at all. And at that point, her husband confided to Dr. Nussbaum that his wife suffered from chronic anxiety. And he asked the doctor if he could prescribe some medication for her anxiety. And the doctor said, "Nervous? What's there to be nervous about? You should be happy that your heart is okay." And the husband indicated with a gesture that matters were not so simple. And he looked for his wife for permission to share something private with the doctor, and she nodded. And the husband said, "We had a tragedy in our life." And although it was not Dr. Nussbaum's manner to be nosy, he asked, "What was it?" I mean, this was uncharacteristic of him. Sometimes we find ourselves surprised by the words that come out of our mouths. Dr. Nussbaum pressed for further details. "What was the tragedy in your life?" And the man said, 35 years ago, our 18-year-old daughter was killed when her car was hit by a garbage truck. And Dr. Nussbaum, again, very uncharacteristic, he said, "Where did the accident take place?" And the man said, "In Montreal." And Dr. Nussbaum said, "Exactly where in Montreal?" And the old man said, "In Saint Laurent." And Dr. Nussbaum looked at them and said, "I was there." When Earl Nussbaum was 10 years old, a fatal accident took place at a busy intersection at the end of the street where he lived. A garbage truck struck a small Austin Mini on the passenger side with such force that the front wheel of the truck was bent inward. When the curious boy joined the crowd that gathered at the scene of the accident, he saw a body lying on the grass nearby under a tarp. Long after the gawkers had left the scene, young Earl remained. He was there when the hearse from the morgue arrived and lifted the tarp to reveal a beautiful young girl with long blonde hair. As the morgue workers lifted her, the young boy noted that there was no disfiguration of any kind. She appeared to be sleeping peacefully. Even the way her limbs hung as she was being carried did not suggest any broken bones. For over a week afterwards, Earl, 10-year-old Earl, had nightmares every night, which left the scene permanently engraved in his mind. Now, 35 years later, in his office, Dr. Nussbaum related his tale to the still bereft parents of that beautiful girl with the long blonde hair. And of course, he was a trained cardiologist, so he added, "She didn't suffer at all." And the old woman, the mother, said, "Really? I saw her afterwards, and I always wondered about that." With the benefit of his expertise as a cardiologist, Dr. Nussbaum assured them that death had been caused by the rupturing of the connection between the pulmonary artery and the aorta. At birth, the ligamentum arteriosum forms out of scar tissue, and connects the two parts of the circulatory system. In high impact injuries, that ligament pulls out of the aorta like a plug ripped from its socket. Death is instantaneous. All this he explained to the victim's parents. The three of them sat there overwhelmed. There was this sense that something supernatural had just taken place. What was the likelihood that 35 years after this tragedy, this Jewish couple would meet a witness of the accident who was qualified to assure them that their daughter had not suffered? Surely it was no coincidence. They felt that God had left them a calling card. A calling card means that God was there, even though he was not seen at the time. If God had arranged this serendipitous meeting, it was a sign he did care about them. The next time they saw Dr. Nussbaum, he did something also was very uncharacteristic of him. He handed them the book, The Garden of Emunah by Rabbi Shalom Arush. This blockbuster bestseller asserts the foundations of Jewish faith, that despite appearances, everything comes from God and everything from God is good. Although our limited human comprehension may not be able to see God's hidden hand or the inscrutable goodness hidden in what we experience as painful. 1 year later, Dr. Nussbaum saw the elderly couple again. They were so transformed since the previous year that he didn't recognize them until they reminded him about the whole car accident experience that he had seen as a young boy. They had undergone a total metamorphosis. The elderly woman exuded happiness and peace of mind. At the following year's examination, the elderly couple still looked peaceful and happy. And Dr. Nussbaum couldn't resist asking what accounted for their transformation. The elderly woman replied that the first step had been their amazing encounter. The second step had been reading the Garden of Emunah, which had convinced them that everything comes from God and that he indeed orchestrates events for their ultimate, if not immediate, good. Even in their tragedy, God was present, they now knew. He had left them his calling card. So these are just two stories, again, from my book, Heaven Prince. And you can see underneath in the notes how you can order it. But these are just two stories that show us the hidden hand of God. In one story, God's manifestation was immediate and very precise. $50,000 within hours. In the other story, it took 35 years for God's hidden hand to become manifest and revealed. Sometimes it takes a very long time. In my book, my newest book, I've been here before, When Souls of the Holocaust Return, about the Holocaust, we see that there can be a very long time between a tragedy and some perspective and understanding of the tragedy. But God is always present and God always loves us. And the message of Purim is a message of great joy, great salvation occurred. We were saved from Haman's terrible edict of genocide. And sometimes it doesn't happen. In the Purim story, all the events from the time of Haman getting the king Ahasuerus to make the decree until the celebration of Purim and the decree being not rescinded. The king couldn't rescind the decree, but gave the Jews the power to fight back and defend themselves. And the miraculous salvation of Purim was 1 year. Often it takes a lot longer than 1 year, or sometimes, like in the case of Sean Levy, it could take just a few hours. But to know that God is always here, even when he's hidden. That's the main message of Purim. Have a very happy Purim.